That's good stuff. How y'all doing? Good. Pretty good. All right. Take your Bibles. Go with me to the book of Judges. And if you're new to Casas, welcome again. And we've been in this series called Sticks, Stones, and Jawbones, kind of looking at these stories that come from some of the dark ages, so to speak, kind of time of Israel as they've come out of captivity of Egypt and they've gone into the promised land, but yet haven't fully established kingdom and rule yet, and David and Solomon aren't there yet. And so there's kind of these dark ages and dark times in their history as they're wandering. And so we've been looking at these stories and pulling out some things, and that's what we're going to do today. And in Judges chapter 2, you can really read about this cycle that is kind of just a part of the story, the bigger story, the meta-narrative that's going on here is that the people's hearts, they're for God, and God rescues them, and then something happens, and just time goes by, and their heart devotion to God just becomes diluted, and they begin to kind of get distracted and go after other gods and false religions, and then they're sold into this slavery, and other nations come and just kind of take reign over them, and then they're crying out to God again, and we see this cycle all throughout the book of Judges. And so we see that. We've looked at a few different stories that we've looked at yet, and today in this story we're going to see this same cycle play out. And God raises up this judge. And when we talked about judges, not like a Judge Judy. This is a leader in the history of their nation of that time. God raises someone up, and today raises someone maybe that we would see as unlikely. That in contrast with what the backdrop is and what's going on, then we go, okay, that's not the person maybe I would pick, given what's unfolding in this story. And yet, it is who God picks, because God picks differently. So it's interesting. How many of you, when you were a child, you thought of, when you heard the word heroes or heroics, who did you think of? No one's committed. Superman. Okay, Superman is like the number one answer in every service. I'm not sure why, but Superman, someone said Wonder Woman, could be a lady. Okay, Wonder Woman, the lasso thing, that was pretty cool. And so you had these different superheroes. You bought their pajamas, and you wore them, but then you grew up a little bit, and you realized that maybe heroes or people that do heroics are maybe more like soldiers you see in the airport, and you're thanking them for what they do in this. They serve to protect freedom, or maybe first responders kind of come to mind. What normally doesn't come to mind is bus driver. Bus driver? Until this week. Did you hear the story in North Carolina? Of the bus driver who's driving her kids on the way home and begins to smell smoke and just kind of this burning thing, and he goes, this ain't right, just parks on the street, gets the kids out the back of the bus, and moments later, it bursts into the flames. And then you have first responders there to put it out, but this bus driver is the hero in that moment, and this heroics that seems unlikely, but yet is what is necessary and needed in that moment. And I want you to keep that in mind as we dive into the story in Judges chapter 4. It's fascinating that Judges 4 and 5 record the narrative, and kind of one idea is this narrative, this prose. Here's the narrative of what's going to unfold. And then chapter 5 is this song, this poem about it. And if you read both, it kind of gives you deeper expression to what's going on. And we'll pick that up at the end of the sermon today. But I want to walk through this story. And as we walk through it, I want to pull out some things for us to wrestle with, some things for us to say, maybe this is some application for us today. And so here's this cycle begins to play out in a new way. After Ehud died, this is verse 1, where we started the whole series looking at Ehud and his story. The Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, a king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera. Now, Jabin was, you can read about it in Joshua chapter 11. Joshua, going into the promised land, fights Jabin, the original Jabin, and is defeated there, and maybe there's a remnant there, and they've kind of come back into power a little bit. And Jabin, more than likely, most scholars believe, is just a title given to the king over the Canaanite area in this northern part of the Transjordan, and where this is kind of taking place. And so Jabin's this king, and he has this henchman named Sisera. And this henchman is just, he's cruel. He commits atrocities over and above what you'd read about. In fact, if you study in history and you begin to read about him and kind of just the things of how they would unfold the destruction, you read about, we hear words like, okay, they pillaged the people. Now think about everything that goes along with that. For men, women, and children, and property. This guy is a evil man. And his reign of terror is lasted now, the text says, for 20 years over this region. And he is just wreaking havoc among the people there. And think about how they sense, how the people of God, and they're finally at this place, the text goes on, that they're crying out to Yahweh, God, help us. Help us. We're in dire straits. Sisera was a guy that had this massive military might. In fact, you can read here that he has these 900 iron chariots. I mean, think about that. This is pre-aircraft. This is just military people out on the battlefield. And you roll up with 900 iron chariots. Think about the sound of what that would have been. Why did they have that? Well, part of it's because it's military might. Part of it's intimidation. That's why they used to say the Roman soldiers would march with their armor all in unison. Why? Because the sound carried. And so intimidation got there before you ever did. And so all this region is known as Sisera and his army, these iron chariots that would come out. Some say that the chariots would have these spears that would come out from the chariot body type thing and would just roll through armies, slicing and dicing people. So this is what they know. Sisera is probably this guy who probably doesn't have a lot of thought for people in life, who probably believes that he's an untouchable, that he's God-like, maybe, in his own mind. And he's wreaking havoc across this region. And the narrator's wanting us to feel and sense this. Now, juxtapose this with who God picks to be the leader in this moment. Given that backdrop, given that history, given the dire straits and the dark ages time that they live in, who does God pick to raise up? Look at verse 4. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. You have this monster in the north who's ruling with an iron fist. And the people of Israel who are in disarray are being led by a mom with a gentle hand. And the narrator's wanting you and I to feel the contrast in that. That doesn't seem like it goes together. That's an unlikely pairing of where hope and healing and where deliverance can come from. Can you feel that? And in this moment, God is saying, this is the one that I need. See, friends, God picks differently than you and I. We look at that scenario, I look at that scenario and go, okay, you need someone with military strategy. You need someone with military might. You need something different, not a mom. Although I've met some soccer moms. But in this moment, God says, I pick differently. See, man looks at the outer appearance, but I look at the heart. And a person who's aligned with me, who has a willing heart, I can use. And so the text kind of unpacks a little bit of, it doesn't give you a lot, so you study the history a little bit of Deborah. Not many sermons done on the topic of Deborah and her reign and all that, but you realize she's not just judging the people. There's, obviously this is the dark ages. Justice is hard to come by. So people are coming to her. She lives about 8 miles north of Jerusalem in that region. And most of this is happening even up further north of her. And she's there and she's leading this ragtag group of people who are just been decimated by all that's going on. And they're coming to her for seeking justice and different issues that are going on. And she's playing that role and doing that role. But she's also, most scholars believe, she's kind of this governor of a way, just kind of governing over the people. And she's also this prophet, who prophets we know are kind of like God's mouthpiece to the people, saying, here's the ways of God. Here's who God is, calling the hearts of the people back to him. And so this contrast is playing out in such a way that you can't help but get kind of swept over by the irony of this. It's this ruler with an iron fist and this mom with a gentle hand. And the contrast and battle that's going to play out is this amazing thing. God can use an unlikely individual who has a willing heart that put in the hands of a great and good God can do undeniably great things. We begin to see this. And so one day, Deborah gets this word, and she sends a message to Barak. And Barak is a leader in the north. He's kind of this military leader, so to speak, but it's a ragtag group of people. And he's had battles and come into contact with Sisera before in his armies. And here's how usually those battles go. 20 years of oppression, here's what happens. Barak shows up, and Sisera's there with his army and his chariots and all that stuff. And usually Barak would say, armor slows you down when you run. So everyone just kind of take off your armor, drop your swords, run for the trees, because chariots don't do well in trees. So let's just get to the hills, let's get to the trees, let's run, because this guy has been wreaking havoc for 20 years. No one has gone up against him and won. We don't read that anywhere. And so Sisera and his army is just dominating. So Deborah gets this word. She sends message to Barak, who's up north, comes down to her, and here's how that unfolds. Verse 6, she sends for him, he comes down, and then she gives this message of the Lord. The Lord has heard our cries. He will be our deliverer, she says. Here's what she says. The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and I will give them into your hands. I'll lure them in. So this message from the Lord says, look, you're the guy. Here's what you're going to do. God's going to deliver his people. And you need to go to the top of Mount Tabor and wait there. God's going to lure this army into the Kishon Valley down below, and God's going to win. Now, if you're Barak, when you've traveled 30, 40 miles to get down here, you know who Deborah is. She's the leader of the people. And you hear this message, what are you thinking? You had way too much coffee today. There is no way that plan works. I'm sorry. See, I've been out there, and Sisera's army, his chariots roll up, and here's what we do. We run. Okay? So far, that's worked. We run. Because every time we've tried something different than running away and running toward, it didn't work so well. So we take off to the trees. Chariots don't do well in trees. And Deborah says, here's a word from the Lord. That this day that's coming is a different day. And you are to have a different plan. And he's hesitant. He's reluctant to be expected. True? And so he says words like this. Barak said to her, now, if you go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go with me, I ain't going. I'm not going to do it. And Deborah's response is this beautiful response. Okay, I will go with you. See what? Barak gets a lot of flack here in the sense of saying, he was hesitant, he was reluctant, he didn't step out, but you have to put yourself in his shoes. This is a suicidal mission. No one's ever made it through this. And yet in this time, he's saying, look, I will go if you go, because I know you're in tight with God. And I know that. And if you're saying God's presence is going to be there, it would really make me more comfortable if you were there with me. And I'll go if you go. But if you don't, I'm not just taking this as a word and I'm just going to take off and do it. No. And so she leaves her post. Everything that she's been doing, travels up north with him, and then he takes his army. He gets the 10,000 that God said he was going to rally. They try from different tribes. Some tribes come out to help. Some don't. We read about that in chapter 5. He's up on top of this mountain. And then God begins to lure Sisera and his army down to the Kishon Valley. This begins to play out. It's interesting here is verse 11. Verse 11 makes no sense in the context of this story right here. It's about Heber the Kenite, who left the other Kenites, descendants of Hobab and Moses' brother-in-law, and took his tent underneath a great tree. And you read that and you go, what? How many of you read stories to your kids? This isn't like a guilt-producing thing. I was just trying to ask. How many of you read stories to your kids? And so you read stories to your kids. You ever do this? You make up part of the story? I do this all the time. It's awesome. Because I get tired of reading the same stories. And so I'll be like, and the bunny's hopping through the garden, and a tank rolls over and then my kids are like, no, that's not what happens. I'm like, okay. And then I go back to the story because I'm bored in that. And I'm just trying to make something up. And sometimes you look at this and you go, okay, is the author bored with the story that's building? Because the story is building, and all of a sudden he's talking about tent people. Tent people? Really? That has nothing to do with the story. Or does it? Or does it? See, God's sovereignty is at play and at work behind the scenes. And as we looked into the story of Ruth and Naomi, sometimes God's at work. Sometimes God's secretly at work behind the scenes, and you don't even recognize it. Friends, we serve a God who is at work behind the scenes of your life, doing some things that maybe you don't even recognize in the moment. But he's at work, and he's building. So verse 12 happens. When they told Sisera that Barak's army is up there and on this mountain, and then he kind of rushes down into the Kishon Valley. Kishon Valley, you have to understand, is this valley at the base of the mountain, kind of a large valley. It has a brook that kind of runs through it in the dry season. In the rainy season, it's pockets of like swamp. Anyone watch Swamp People? It's an interesting show. That's all I'm going to say. But it's kind of the swamp, marshy type area during the rainy season. During the dry seasons, it's just this brook that kind of runs through it. And chariots can roll through a brook, right? And this is the dry season. That's why Sisera would bring an army of chariots, iron chariots, heavy, into a valley like this. And all of a sudden, the story is kind of building momentum. And then Deborah says these words to Barak. One day, they're up on top of the mountain. She says, go. This is the day. This is the day where everything changes. This is the day where God's story gets written anew and afresh among our people. This is the day that you are to go. The Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not Yahweh gone ahead of you already? Has not Yahweh already gone ahead of you? He has already stirred up and brought people to where he said he was going to be. He's already stirred up the 10,000 that he said that you needed. God, he's already gone ahead of you of what you're about ready to face. Today is that day. How many of you remember the 1980s Miracle on Ice, the U.S. hockey team that beat the Russian Olympic team? And what do the commentators say? 99 times out of 100, they lose, and it goes the other way. But on that day, they pulled it off. This is the miracle in the Kishon Valley. This is what's going to transpire and happen. In the verse right before verse 15, so Barak went down Mount Tabor, followed by the 10,000 men. Verse 15, at Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and his chariots and the army by the sword. Everyone's gone. And Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled away on foot. If you have a pen, I want you to underline verse 15. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed. What he's saying here is, look, when God gives you a promise, as you move forward in that promise, his provision will follow. If he's given you a promise of his presence, he's with you. And as you move forward in that promise, his provision will follow. He's saying this is the miracle of Kishon Valley. This is the day. Every other day, it may go another way, but this is the day that the Lord has handed over Sisera and his army to you, Barak. This is the day you're to go. And so Deborah kind of gives this charge, and Barak kind of says, okay, let's go. We're running down. And can you imagine as he's running down? Because here's what you find out in chapter 5, verse 20 and 21. You begin to see that this dry season is dry no more. God begins to send rain. And God begins to oversee this marshland become muddy. And guess what doesn't run well in mud? Iron chariots. They sink. And so could you imagine Barak and his army charging down this mountain, kind of the Lord of the Rings type moment as they're running down, thinking, every other time I've run the opposite direction. And now I'm running toward them. And you know whose fear I see? I don't see my fear in the mirror. I see their eyes getting bigger. As suddenly this rain is coming. Who is the false god who's over agriculture? Take a wild guess. Baal. This is the dry season. And what Yahweh is saying is, no, you're chasing after things that aren't even real. I control the weather. I'm in charge of that. And this dry season is dry no more. And the story begins to unfold. Sisera, this cruel man, takes off running in this other direction up over the hills. And now verse 11 finally makes sense. As God's sovereignty has been over this entire thing, he's the one that says to Deborah, this is the moment where I'm going to deliver. This is the person you need to have in partnership with, and so go get him. This is the plan. You're to go to the top of the mountain, and I'm going to lure the army down to the Kishon Valley. God's the one that's been initiating this whole thing. His sovereignty is at play, his control throughout this whole thing, and he's the one that cuts off the escape route. Because what seemed like a silly verse in verse 11, an abnormal thing that wouldn't even be in there, actually comes to play one of the key moments of the whole entire story. As Sisera takes off from battle, he's watched his whole army be decimated. Can you imagine this moment for him? As he's running, as he comes up to this region of this place, and he sees these tents, and he runs up to one, and Jael is there. She's the wife of Heber, who has this peace treaty, so to speak, with Jabin, who's this henchman's boss. And he says, I can hide out here. And so he says, I'm going to go in the tent. I'm thirsty. Can you bring me a drink of water? She brings him a skin of milk, and it would be in this bowl. The Hebrew commentators kind of say it's this bowl of nobility, that nobles, leaders, kings would have been handed this kind of bowl. And so she hands him this bowl of curdled milk, which is really gross, but back in their day, they really liked that, I guess. So he drinks this, he falls asleep. She covers him over with a blanket, maybe a towel, whatever it might be, a rug. And he says to her, if anyone comes looking for me, you say that, if they say, has a stranger been through you, you just say no. Anyone ever played hide and seek before? And in playing hide and seek, maybe you're hiding, and the person who's maybe not it, but someone else finds you, and you're like, hey, this is my spot. Don't tell anybody. Go away. And you're like, don't say anything. And so that's kind of what's happening here is I'm hiding here in this spot. This is my spot. No one else should know that I'm here. And the story begins to keep unfolding. And look at verse 19. I'm thirsty. She gives him a drink. 20, okay, stand there, tell people no. Verse 21, but Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him. This is where the Bible gets a little PG-13 in violence. She takes this tent peg and hammer, goes quietly to him as he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and I love the next part, and he died. I love the Bible. It has this sense of humor to it. It wants you to make sure that this is not just someone who fell on a stick and it happened to go through their skull in a way that a doctor can heal them and recover and they're going to be fine. No, he died. Why? Because he ran to the tent people and to the wife who had set up many tents and who understands what tent pegs can do and understands what 20 years of cruelty and atrocities have done to people that she knows about and can take no more. See, this is dark ages kind of stuff, and sometimes this justice is this Western justice that gets played out. Why? Because God's sovereignty has all been at play. See, remember back to the original commissioning of Barak and the hesitation that he had. I'm reluctant. I don't know if I could fully take this, Deborah. Deborah says to him, you can read, okay, because the way you're going about this, the honor of the finish of this will go to another woman, not you. You'll still be usable, and God still has a use for you, and you still play a big part in this. But the final takedown of this tyranny that's there will no longer belong to you. There'll be another woman that handles that. And here we see that play out. And Barak runs up to the tent. He's in hot pursuit. Verse 22, came by in pursuit, and Sisera, Jael went out to meet him. Come, I will show you the man you're looking for. So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with a tent peg through his temple, and just in case you forgot, he's dead. On that day, God subdues the people. They end up overtaking Jabin and the rule that he has there in Hazor, this fortified city, and peace comes to the land for the next 40 years. Maybe some thoughts. God has a tendency, a habit, of using what seems unlikely to do undeniably great things. You may sit here and go, well, Jack, you don't know my story. God can't use me. I'm disqualified because of my past. I'm inadequate. I can't be usable by God. I don't measure up to what he needs. And I want to say to you, this story says differently. God's stories throughout the scripture say differently. That we follow a God that all who turn toward him, he can rebuild and repair, and he wants to use you. Those who have a willing heart, God desires them. And they may seem unlikely, but that's just who God loves to use the most. This notion and truth of all that begins to play out in this story. God's sovereignty is at work behind the scenes. Friends, he is at work behind the scenes of your life. You may not even see it, but he's there. And when God promises his presence, you can move forward, no matter what's thrown at you, because he's with you. So Judges 4, this narrative comes to a close, and then we see Judges 5. It's the only time in Judges you'll see a song, a poem written. In fact, the last time you kind of see this is Exodus 15, when Moses and Miriam have a song, because Exodus 14 is all about the people going through the parted sea and the Egyptian army chasing in after them, and God closes over them and routs them in one day, and then they sing a song. And the song is put out to say, I want to help you remember. Why? Because songs help you remember. And in an oratory culture, they help you kind of anchor you, maybe re-anchor you to the truth of what's unfolding. And so what we see here is Judges chapter 5 illuminates some things to this narrative we saw in chapter 4, but it's really trying to draw people back. The devotion you had for Yahweh that you've allowed to drift, bring it back. There is only one God who is sovereign. See, the relational side of sovereignty is this, that you have free will, and so do I. God is also fiercely free. He doesn't fit in our boxes. And his sovereignty means he has control. We like control. How many of you like control? We like to think we're in control, but we're really not. God's in control. But he gives you free will. And so the interplay of this free will and yet God being fiercely free and able to be in charge of everything is always at play. God is not a puppeteer who controls things. You are not robotic. You have free will. That's why bad things can happen to good people, because we live in the brokenness of this world. And yet God's sovereignty is always at work behind the scenes. And God's sovereignty says, I can use anyone, anything, at any time to accomplish my will. I will not manipulate, but my will get accomplished. See, that's the interplay. And what God longs for is people that have willing hearts. And so this song gets played. That's why songs work. They help you remember. Ba-da-ba-ba-bum. I'm loving it. Advertisers know this truth, don't they? That's why jingles work, because it sticks with you. That's why my daughter runs around the house singing math problems. Math problems! Why? Because it helps her remember. That's why she sings the answers to her history quiz, because it helps her remember. Songs have a way of doing that. They have a way of re-anchoring you, helping you see. And that's what Deborah is wanting her people to see. We are serving the one God who is in control and who is a deliverer at very heart. And he has delivered us again. And so this song in an oratory culture would get sung as people would remember. And so today, as Deborah's story ends with a song, So our story will end today in this song. A song about our God and who he is and what he's really like. And I want to invite you just to lean into this moment, to sing and to worship with your heart as you sing about the God who is your deliverer, who is just as true in this story as he is in your story. He's at work. He loves to use unlikely things, to do undeniably great things for him. So would you pray with me as we get ready to sing? Father, as we lean into your word, to your truth in this song, may we worship you. God, may you stir our hearts to remind us again, this is about remembrance of who you really are. And in the scope of life, of what we face and what faces us, God, you are